Blessed Lord, brothers and sisters. This is not a Shabbat lesson per se, this is an impromptu video, right? I'm going to title this video, right? This is how the white man use crack and their laws to destroy the so-called black community or black people, right? This article is taken from Atlanta Black Star, right? 10 ways the US government used the crack epidemic to justify the wars on drugs, right? In 1982, when the President Ronald Reagan declared a war on drugs, recreational drug use in the US was in serious decline. Reagan's declaration of war tapped into a growing public sentiment against illegal drug use. So the declaration was more about politics than about drugs presenting an actual danger to the nation. For the constituency the Reagan administration was trying to reach, it was easy to construct so-called African Americans as the enemy in the war on drugs, leading to the mass incarceration that has imprisoned millions and devastated black communities across the US. To sell the war, the administration created a monster, crack, and to go along with the crack monster, the government and the media pushed a series of myths. From the beginning of the crack scare in early 1986, politicians and the media found it useful to speak of crack as if it were an entirely new substance with unprecedented powers. This was false, as pointed out by the researchers Craig Ryan and Harry G. Levine. Crack was only a new form of a very old substance. Crack is cocaine that has been cooked down to a smokable base form, but its active ingredient is entirely cocaine, a drug in use in the US for over a century, just as humans can get more drunk much faster by downing shots of vodka. And then by sipping wine. So can we get a more instant rush by smoking crack cocaine than by snorting powder cocaine? The claim that crack was a new, deeply dangerous drug allowed the media to write dramatic stories about it and politicians to scapegoat and pass punitive new laws against it, laws that punish so-called black people. Crack use was a plague. The evidence that crack was neither instantly nor inevitably addicting was available in every government survey on drug use that asks about crack from 1987 on. A survey funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse in the late 1980s to measure the prevalence of drug use among young people found that despite hysteria about crack killing a whole generation of our children, less than 5% of 18 to 29 years old in the US had ever tried it, let alone gone on to use it regularly, abuse it, get addicted to it, or die from it. Contrary to the confident prediction of politicians, police chiefs, drug treatment entrepreneurs, and the media, crack use never spread very far outside impoverished inner city neighborhoods, brothers and sisters. So you see, they've been actively against you from the time you were taken from Northeast Africa and the surrounding areas to the West and to the Caribbean. They're actively passing laws against you, and I've said this previously in many videos that I did. They actively pass laws against you, and you don't even want to see because you're being ignorant and foolish to the devices of the devil. You need to wake up. You understand, brothers and sisters? Wake up and smell that coffee or smell the rose or whatever. You understand? So without further delay, I need you to watch this video that's about to come up, brothers and sisters. It's going to explain that error also. Alright? And this is also fulfillment of the curses of Deuteronomy. Right, brothers and sisters? that the Most High justly and rightfully put upon us because of our stiff-necked ways of our forefathers first and our continued disobedience till this day. Why we are in the situation we are in because of the hardness of your heart and the stiff-neckedness of your neck, brothers and sisters. Repent and come back to the Most High so He could give you a heart of understanding and a heart of spiritual flesh, brothers and sisters. Do you understand? Alright, so again, without further ado, please watch this video. Blessed love.
And they will not have a chance.
In the early 1980s, the nation's slogan was...
And specifically blacks going to jail and to prison, and they will not have a chance.
In the early 1980s, the nation's slogan was clear.
Just say no.
Crack now has spread to almost every American city.
But what if I told you that there was more to the crack era than what the white mainstream news media let on? And that it went beyond Black and Latinx folks who simply needed to kick a drug habit. Today's baggage, how the war on drugs ravaged Black America. Once upon a time, in a not so far away and familiar place, the United States entered what became known as the crack era. During the early 1980s, a new drug somehow infiltrated low-income Black and brown communities, causing crime and chaos. It was called
crack cocaine.
The problem is crack cocaine.
Crack cocaine may deny these black children a decent future.
Well, it turns out that your uncle, who always talks about the man, was right. Well, sort of. While crack did absolutely ravage some Black and brown communities, it wasn't that simple. The United States government and agents of the state were corrupt and had a hand in creating this dark time in America's history. Misinformation about crack cocaine and its users flooded airwaves and proved to be just as dangerous as the substance itself. Decades after the crack era has come and gone, its impact lives on. But before we fall any deeper into this rabbit hole, let's take it back to the beginning of this war on drugs, which is often dubbed America's longest war in history.
Please search for it!
The federal government first banned the recreational use of a substance, opium, in the early 1900s. Then came the Prohibition era, which focused on alcohol. Shortly after, the feds began to track and vilify people who struggled with addiction, especially if they were Black. Fast forward to 1971, when Richard Nixon declared war.
America's public enemy #1 is drug abuse.
2 presidents later, Ronald Reagan not only carried on, but weaponized this anti-drug stance.
Drugs are menacing our society.
Though Reagan was the first president who promised to
Make America great again.
but rather he made things worse for low-income communities. In fact, at the time, the poverty rate grew faster in the first 3 years of Reagan's presidency than in any other time since the 1950s. Meanwhile, in another part of the world, the United States was funding an illegal war in Nicaragua, and drug smugglers were sending cocaine to the U.S. on U.S. planes. Somehow, the United States officials had no clue.
Whether the United States actually loaded up the planes with cocaine, or whether they just kind of turned their backs, right, and let the planes take off and go to the United States and land, the United States knew that at the very least that cocaine was being flown in and just ignored it.
Stanley Nelson is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, MacArthur genius, and director of Crack, Cocaine, Corruption, and Conspiracy. He says that this rampant poverty and international scandal, which caused cocaine to flood the United States, was the backdrop in which the crack era took off.
The crack era seemed to come out of nowhere, somewhere in the early 80s. All of a sudden, everywhere in Harlem, people would be out on the street selling and using crack. Not only in Harlem, I remember, I was walking across 42nd Street and people were in doorways smoking crack.
In his film, Nelson walks viewers through various phases of the crack epidemic.
at first, we saw it in the African American Latinx communities. Then, we're like, oh my God, there's an epidemic. The politicians weren't talking about it. The media wasn't talking about it. The police were not stopping it. That's a big part of it.
Some dirty cops took money from drug dealers, or they took drug money themselves.
What would you steal? Money and drugs and guns, whatever was it.
And somehow this fact was left out of the media. Wonder why. And then there was a shift.
A local success story took a tragic turn this morning.
Maryland basketball star Len Bias died after overdosing on cocaine 2 days after he was drafted to the Boston Celtics.
It was like a political wet dream, because now all politicians, Democrats, Republicans, everybody was talking about the scourge of crack and the evil dealers who are dealing crack. And it was crazily overblown.
And from the era emerged some dangerous myths about Black people.
First of all, there was the crackhead, just had given up their lives to crack and, would do anything for crack. Then there was a crack mama. That was, basically Black women. This woman sold her baby for a crack.
And an equally damaging falsehood, the crack baby.
Despite all the warnings, a growing number of babies are being born already addicted to cocaine.
They'll spend the rest of their lives suffering for the lifestyle of their mothers.
What would you do about pregnant women who use drugs and pass those drugs onto their babies?
The media played a huge part in making the public feel that crack was really the real threat and that treatment wasn't the answer, but jail.
And the federal government's response to the war on drugs was clear. Lock them up and throw away the key.
They could come up with a new drug tomorrow, and we're going to go out there and do the same thing we're doing today. We ain't going to stop.
While chemically, powder cocaine, which was often used by white people, and crack cocaine, which was more accessible and believed to be used by Black people, are practically the same, if you're caught using or selling either drug, the law says otherwise. During the crack era, the sentencing disparity was crazy. The rule was 100 to 1. So 5 grams of crack would land you with a 5-year mandatory minimum, but it would take 500 grams of cocaine to get the same sentence. Now, here's the kicker. Black people made up 82% of the folks convicted for federal crack and cocaine offenses, but only 30% of crack users. 62% of people convicted for crack offenses were low-level sellers or lookouts. Today, the number of Americans incarcerated for drug offenses went from 40,900 in 1980 to 443,200 in 2018. With over 2 million people locked up, which is a 500% increase over the last 40 years, 1 in 5 incarcerated people is locked up for a drug offense. And being convicted of a felony can impact your voting rights, access to loans, and ability to get a job, among other factors. To say that the war on drugs filled our prisons and changed the trajectory of hundreds of thousands of people's lives would not be inaccurate. And Nelson reminds us that the war on drugs also changed the way that we look at policing.
The war on drugs was part of the fuel for local police to become militarized. And that's what we saw, over and over again in Ferguson and with the George Floyd protests, cops with body armor, and looking like something out of Star Wars. So that becomes part of our lives now. And a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it started, with the crack epidemic.
Decades after the crack epidemic is said and done, do you think that the forces that coalesced to create the period in time that we know as the crack era actually understood the implications of their actions?
I feel at this moment more and more that the United States knows what it is and knows what it does and knows that it's racist and doesn't care. I don't want to give America a pass anymore. African Americans, Latinx, and progressive people have to start there and then push for change.
The crack era vilified Black and Latinx people, and that's a fact. During this period in time, there was no solution other than jail. No consideration for how trauma and poverty could lead one to get involved with crack. No treatment for those who suffered from addiction. No discussion of a public health crisis. And certainly no empathy. While others may not remember this bleak period in time, we do. And Black America will never be the same.